What do you do when you realize the homeless man you've been walking past for months is actually one of America's greatest war heroes? When the person everyone ignores turns out to be someone whose face should be on monuments. Sarah Martinez, a college journalism student, was about to find out. Because the Medal of Honor photograph she'd been studying for her research project showed a young soldier receiving America's highest military decoration 20 years ago. And that same face, older, worn by hardship but unmistakable, was sitting on a piece of cardboard outside Union Station, holding a sign that read, "Homeless Veteran, any help appreciated." The question wasn't how she'd found him. The question was how America had lost him. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of recognition, redemption, and the forgotten heroes among us, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe every hero deserves to be seen, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Union Station in Washington, D.C. processed over 100,000 passengers every day. Commuters rushing to catch trains, tourists marveling at the Beaux-Arts architecture, business travelers typing urgently on their phones. In all that human traffic, most people barely noticed the homeless man who sat by the east entrance every morning from 7 a.m. until the evening rush ended. Robert Chen had claimed that spot 3 years ago, not because it was particularly comfortable. The marble floor was cold and hard, but because it offered what his military training had taught him to value: clear sight lines, multiple exit routes, and a position that allowed him to observe without being observed. At 58, Robert looked older than his years. His black hair had gone completely gray, his face was weathered by exposure to the elements, and his clothes, donated items from various shelters, hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful but was now diminished by poor nutrition and the accumulated toll of living rough. He kept his possessions in a shopping cart secured with a bike lock, a sleeping bag, a few changes of clothes, a thermos, some books, and a small canvas bag that he never let out of his sight. To the thousands of people who passed him daily, he was just another homeless veteran, invisible, unfortunate, but ultimately forgettable. Robert had perfected the art of invisibility. He never aggressively panhandled, never bothered commuters who didn't want to be bothered, never caused problems that would attract police attention. His cardboard sign was simple and honest: homeless veteran, any help appreciated. Some people dropped coins or bills into his cup. Most walked past without making eye contact. The irony of his invisibility would have been bitter if Robert had allowed himself to think about it. 23 years earlier, he had been the most visible soldier in America. His face on magazine covers, his story told in newspapers across the country, his hand shaken by presidents and generals. But that was before Somalia, before the nightmares started, before everything fell apart. Now he measured success in small increments: enough money for a meal, a night at a shelter when the weather was bad, occasionally enough to buy a newspaper so he could stay connected to a world that had forgotten he existed. The commuters who passed him every day had no idea they were walking past a man who had single-handedly saved 17 lives during the Battle of Mogadishu. No idea that the quiet homeless veteran had once been awarded the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, for actions so extraordinary that the citation had classified portions that remained redacted to this day. Robert preferred it that way. Anonymity was safer than recognition, because recognition led to questions, and questions led to conversations about things he wasn't ready to discuss. Better to be invisible than to be seen as a failure, a cautionary tale about what happened to heroes when the war ended and the parades were over. Sarah Martinez was a senior at Georgetown University, majoring in journalism with a focus on military affairs and veteran issues. At 22, she had the idealism and energy of someone who believed that good reporting could change the world, and the academic curiosity to dig deeper into stories that others might overlook. Her current project was a comprehensive piece about Medal of Honor recipients from the post-Vietnam era, specifically what happened to these decorated heroes after the ceremonies ended and they returned to civilian life. It was ambitious research that had taken her months to organize, involving interviews, archival research, and tracking down recipients who often preferred privacy to publicity. Sarah's daily routine included catching the 8:15 a.m. train from Union Station to her internship at a veterans advocacy organization in Baltimore. Like most commuters, she'd learned to navigate the station efficiently, walking quickly from the metro entrance to track 16 while checking emails on her phone. She'd noticed the homeless man by the east entrance, of course. He was impossible to miss after 3 years of taking the same route. But Sarah had never really looked at him, not with the attention she gave to her subjects when she was reporting. He was part of the background, another person caught in circumstances she didn't fully understand, but felt sympathy for from a distance. That changed on a Tuesday evening in late October when Sarah was working on her Medal of Honor project in the university library. She'd spread dozens of photographs across a large table, official military portraits, ceremony photos, candid shots of recipients throughout their lives. The goal was to create a visual timeline showing how these heroes' lives had evolved after their moment of recognition. One photograph had been particularly difficult to research. A 1994 ceremony photo showing President Clinton presenting the Medal of Honor to a young Army sergeant named Robert Chen. The accompanying documentation was sparse. Much of Chen's service record remained classified, but Sarah had managed to piece together the basic facts. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, had been awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during the Battle of Mogadishu in October 1993. According to the unclassified portions of his citation, Chen had repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers during the firefight that became known as Black Hawk Down. When his unit was pinned down by overwhelming enemy forces, Chen had single-handedly held off attackers while organizing the evacuation of 17 wounded men. The photograph showed a young man, maybe 25 years old, standing at attention as the president placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. His face was serious, composed, carrying the weight of what he'd experienced and the honor he was receiving. Sarah stared at that face for a long time, feeling like she'd seen it somewhere before, but unable to place where. The feeling nagged at her through dinner, through her evening classes, through her walk back to her apartment. There was something familiar about Staff Sergeant Robert Chen that she couldn't identify. She was still thinking about it the next morning as she hurried through Union Station to catch her train. That's when she saw him. Really saw him for the first time. The homeless man by the east entrance was adjusting his cardboard sign, and for just a moment he looked up and made eye contact with Sarah. The face was older, weathered by 20 years and hardships she couldn't imagine. The military bearing was gone, replaced by the careful invisibility of someone who had learned to avoid attention. But the bone structure was the same, the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw. Sarah stopped walking so suddenly that a businessman behind her almost collided with her. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to the photograph she'd saved from her research, and looked from the screen to the man sitting 10 feet away. There was no doubt. The homeless veteran she'd been walking past for 3 years was Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, Medal of Honor recipient, one of America's most decorated war heroes. Sarah missed her train that morning. Instead, she stood frozen on the concourse of Union Station, staring at a photograph on her phone and then at the man who had been invisible to her for 3 years. The implications of what she was seeing crashed over her in waves. Professional excitement at stumbling onto an incredible story, followed immediately by shame at her own blindness, then confusion about how this could have happened. Robert noticed her staring and looked up with the wary expression of someone accustomed to unwanted attention. In his experience, people who stared too long usually meant trouble. Security guards who might ask him to move, police officers responding to complaints, or occasionally, someone who recognized him from his past and wanted to ask questions he wasn't prepared to answer. "Can I help you, miss?" Robert asked politely, his voice carrying traces of the military courtesy that had never completely left him. Sarah realized she'd been standing there for several minutes without moving. Other commuters were starting to look at her curiously, probably wondering why a young woman in business attire was fixated on a homeless man. I'm sorry," Sarah said, trying to collect her thoughts. "I didn't mean to stare. You look familiar." Robert's expression became more guarded. This was the kind of conversation he'd learned to end quickly. "I don't think we've met, miss. I'm just trying to make it through the day." Sarah looked at her phone again, then back at Robert. The evidence was overwhelming, but the approach required delicacy. This wasn't just a source for a story. This was a human being who had clearly fallen on hard times, someone who deserved respect regardless of his past achievements. "Sir," Sarah said, sitting down on the marble floor next to Robert, ignoring the surprised looks from passing commuters. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm a journalism student, and I've been researching Medal of Honor recipients for a project." Robert's entire demeanor changed. The polite wariness became something harder, more defensive. "I think you have me confused with someone else." "Staff Sergeant Robert Chen," Sarah said gently, showing him the photograph on her phone. "1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, Medal of Honor, October 1993, Battle of Mogadishu." Robert looked at the photograph, himself, 20 years younger, standing in the White House Rose Garden, and something in his face crumbled. Not dramatically, but like a wall that had been holding back water for too long, finally developing a crack. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "Not that long," Sarah replied, "and not long enough for people to forget what you did." Robert was quiet for several minutes, watching the flow of commuters around them. When he spoke again, his voice carried exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. "Look, Miss Sarah, was it? I appreciate what you're trying to do, but that person in the photograph doesn't exist anymore. Whatever story you're working on, I'm not part of it." "But you are," Sarah said. "Whether you want to be or not, you're part of it. The question is whether you want to help me tell it accurately or whether you want me to tell it without your input." It wasn't a threat. Sarah's tone was respectful, even gentle, but it was a recognition of journalistic reality. The story existed whether Robert cooperated or not. The only question was whether he wanted to have a voice in how it was told. Robert studied Sarah's face, perhaps trying to determine what kind of person she was, what her motivations were, whether she could be trusted with something as fragile as a fallen hero's dignity. "What do you want to know?" he asked finally. Sarah suggested they move to a quieter location for their conversation. Robert agreed, but only after securing his shopping cart and checking that all his possessions were accounted for. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in Somalia was still there, adapted now to the different but equally real dangers of life on the streets. They found a corner table in Union Station's food court, far enough from the main traffic flow to allow for private conversation. Sarah bought coffee for both of them and a sandwich for Robert, who accepted the food with the grateful politeness of someone who wasn't sure when his next meal might come. "The last time anyone interviewed me was 1995, Robert said, wrapping his hands around the warm coffee cup. "Right after I got out of the Army. Everyone wanted to know what it felt like to be a hero, what my plans were, what I was going to do with the rest of my life." "What did you tell them?" "What they wanted to hear, that I was proud to serve, that I was looking forward to civilian life, that I had big plans." Robert's smile was bitter. "I believed it too at first. The Army had set me up with job interviews, speaking engagements, opportunities that most veterans never get. Medal of Honor recipients don't usually struggle with the transition." "But you did struggle." "Somalia broke something in me that I didn't even know existed." Robert looked around the food court, perhaps checking exits out of habit, or maybe just avoiding eye contact while he talked about difficult memories. "People think PTSD is about being scared of loud noises or having flashbacks. Sometimes it is. But for me, it was more like disconnection. Like I was watching my life happen to someone else." He took a sip of coffee and continued. "The battle itself wasn't the worst part. I mean, it was hell. 18 hours of urban combat, men dying around me, impossible decisions every few minutes. But I'd been trained for that. Rangers are trained for that. What I wasn't trained for was coming home and pretending it didn't matter." Sarah had interviewed dozens of veterans for various projects, but she'd never heard anyone articulate the challenge quite this way. "The Medal of Honor ceremony was supposed to be the high point," Robert continued, "meeting the president, having my family there, all the recognition. But I kept thinking about the men who didn't come home. 17 soldiers made it out alive because of what I did, but 18 died in that battle. Why was I being celebrated when they were being buried?" "Survivor's guilt," Sarah said. "That's what the therapists called it. The Army sent me to counseling, of course. Had to make sure their poster boy was mentally stable." I went through the motions, said what they wanted to hear, but the truth was that I felt like a fraud. Everyone kept calling me a hero, but I knew the real heroes were the ones who didn't make it home. Robert paused to eat some of his sandwich, and Sarah waited patiently for him to continue. She'd learned that some stories could only be told at their own pace. The job interviews went well at first, Robert said. Everyone wanted to hire a Medal of Honor recipient, defense contractors, security companies, law enforcement agencies. But the positions they offered, they were all based on my reputation, not my abilities. They wanted Robert Chen the hero, not Robert Chen the person. What happened? I couldn't do it, couldn't sit in boardrooms talking about strategy when I was still hearing gunfire in my head, couldn't smile for photo opportunities when I was barely sleeping 3 hours a night. The nightmares were bad, but the disconnection was worse. I felt like I was watching someone else live my life. Robert finished his sandwich before continuing. I started drinking to sleep. Then I started drinking to function. Then I started drinking because it was the only thing that made the world feel real. The speaking engagements became disasters. Job interviews ended early. Friends stopped calling. What about your family? Robert's expression became even more pained. My parents tried to help, but they didn't understand what was happening to me. How could they? I couldn't explain it myself. My father had served in Vietnam, but his experience was different. He came home, got married, started a business, moved on. He couldn't understand why I couldn't do the same thing. When did you become homeless? It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like everything else. Lost jobs, lost apartments, lost relationships. The VA tried to help, but there were waiting lists for everything, bureaucracy that didn't know how to handle someone with my specific combination of problems. I wasn't a typical case. Robert looked directly at Sarah for the first time since they'd started talking. Do you know what the hardest part was? Not the sleeping rough or the hunger or the cold. It was the invisibility. Going from being someone everyone recognized to being someone everyone avoided looking at. Medal of Honor recipients aren't supposed to end up on the streets. It's not part of the narrative. As Robert told his story, Sarah found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected. The professional part of her mind was cataloging details, organizing quotes, thinking about how to structure a narrative that would do justice to what she was hearing. But the human part of her was grappling with anger, not at Robert, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. The VA, Sarah said. Did they know who you were? Did they know about your Medal of Honor? Robert nodded. That was part of the problem. Everyone knew who I was supposed to be, but no one knew how to deal with who I actually was. Medal of Honor recipients get priority treatment at VA facilities, but that just meant I got fast-tracked into programs that weren't designed for my specific issues. What do you mean? Most homeless veterans are dealing with addiction, unemployment, basic survival issues. I was dealing with those things too, but I was also dealing with the psychological weight of being a public symbol who had failed to live up to that symbolism. The counselors didn't know how to handle someone whose trauma was compounded by the expectation that I should be beyond trauma. Sarah made notes as Robert spoke, but she found herself thinking beyond the immediate story. This wasn't just about one fallen hero. It was about systematic failures in how America treated its most decorated veterans. Have you had any contact with other Medal of Honor recipients? She asked. There's an association. They tried to reach out a few times over the years, especially when I first became homeless, but I couldn't face them. These are men who had successfully transitioned to civilian life, who had managed to carry their honors with dignity. I felt like I was betraying what the medal represented. Or maybe you were just dealing with your trauma differently. Robert considered this. Maybe, but it didn't feel that way at the time. It felt like failure. Sarah looked around the food court, watching commuters hurry past with their coffee and smartphones, completely unaware that they were sharing space with one of America's most decorated war heroes. The disconnect was almost surreal. Robert, she said, I want to write about this, not to exploit your situation, but to help people understand what happened to you and why. Would you be okay with that? Robert was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. What would be the point? To make people feel sorry for me? To turn me into a cautionary tale? To help people understand that heroes are human beings, Sarah said, that serving your country with extraordinary courage doesn't make you immune to extraordinary pain, that the system that celebrates heroes isn't always the same system that takes care of them afterward. Robert studied Sarah's face, perhaps trying to determine whether she was someone who could be trusted with his story. "If I agree to this," he said finally, "I want to be involved in how it's told. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone who's been forgotten. I want the story to matter." Sarah reached across the table and shook Robert's hand. "It will matter. I promise you that." Sarah spent the next 3 weeks conducting one of the most intensive research projects of her academic career. She interviewed Robert multiple times, always at his pace and always with his consent. She tracked down military records, spoke with veterans advocates, and connected with other Medal of Honor recipients who were willing to discuss the challenges of post-service life. The story she wrote wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of a simple tale of a hero's fall from grace, Sarah crafted a nuanced examination of how America celebrates military valor while struggling to understand military trauma. She wrote about the specific challenges faced by highly decorated veterans, the inadequacies of existing support systems, and the way that public recognition could sometimes become a burden rather than a blessing. But at the heart of the story was Robert Chen, not as a symbol or a cautionary tale, but as a human being whose extraordinary service had been followed by extraordinary struggles and who deserved recognition for both. The article was published first in the Georgetown University Journalism Review, then picked up by the Washington Post, then syndicated nationally. Within days, it had been shared hundreds of thousands of times on social media, generating responses from veterans, advocates, politicians, and ordinary citizens who were shocked to learn that a Medal of Honor recipient had been living homeless in the nation's capital. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The VA announced a review of services for Medal of Honor recipients. Veterans organizations launched new programs specifically designed for highly decorated veterans dealing with complex trauma. Members of Congress called for hearings on how America cared for its most honored military personnel. But the most important response came from individuals, veterans who reached out to share their own stories, citizens who offered help, and most significantly, other Medal of Honor recipients who had been looking for Robert for years. 3 days after Sarah's story went viral, Robert was sitting in his usual spot at Union Station when a man in his 70s approached and sat down beside him. The stranger was impeccably dressed, not flashy, but with the kind of attention to detail that suggested either military background or professional success. "Robert Chen?" the man asked. Robert looked up warily. Since the story had been published, he'd been approached by dozens of people, some offering help, others just curious, a few trying to exploit his situation for their own purposes. He'd learned to be cautious. "Depends on who's asking," Robert replied. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather case. Inside was a medal Robert recognized immediately, another Medal of Honor, this one awarded for actions in Vietnam. "Master Sergeant James Wilson," the man said. "Charlie Company, 1st Infantry Division. I got mine in 1968 near Cu Chi." Robert stared at the medal, then at Wilson's face. "You're one of us." "I'm one of you," Wilson corrected gently, "and I've been looking for you for 3 years." Over the next hour, Wilson explained that the Medal of Honor Society had been trying to locate Robert ever since they'd learned he was homeless. Not to judge him or to try to fix him, but to offer the support that only came from others who understood the unique burden of carrying America's highest military decoration. "There are 67 living Medal of Honor recipients," Wilson said. "We're a small brotherhood, and we don't leave anyone behind. That includes you, whether you want our help or not." Wilson wasn't the only one. Over the following days, Robert was contacted by a dozen other Medal of Honor recipients, each offering assistance without judgment or conditions. They understood in ways that civilians couldn't what it meant to carry extraordinary recognition for extraordinary actions, and how that recognition could sometimes become its own form of trauma. But the most significant contact came from an unexpected source: the families of the soldiers Robert had saved in Somalia. 6 months after Sarah Martinez first recognized him at Union Station, Robert Chen stood before a microphone in the ballroom of a Washington, D.C. hotel, addressing an audience of veterans, advocates, and family members. It was the first time he'd spoken publicly about his military service in over 20 years. He was no longer homeless. The Medal of Honor Society had arranged temporary housing that had become permanent, along with comprehensive medical and psychological support specifically designed for highly decorated veterans dealing with complex trauma. More importantly, Robert had reconnected with a community that understood his struggles because they had lived variations of them. But the most healing moment had come 2 weeks earlier, when Robert received a letter from Patricia Morrison, the widow of Sergeant First Class David Morrison, one of the 17 soldiers Robert had saved in Mogadishu. Patricia had tracked him down after reading Sarah's article, not to thank him, though she did that, but to tell him about the life her husband had lived after Somalia. David Morrison had come home, married Patricia, raised 3 children, and worked as a paramedic for 22 years before dying of cancer in 2010. His life after Somalia had been rich and meaningful, made possible by Robert's actions during those 18 hours of combat. "Your husband lived because of what you did," Patricia had written, "but more than that, my children exist because of what you did. My grandchildren carry your legacy in their DNA. You didn't just save 17 soldiers that day, you saved all the lives that grew from those soldiers coming home." The letter had been accompanied by photographs: David Morrison's wedding, his children's graduations, family Christmas mornings, birthday parties, ordinary moments that were only possible because Robert Chen had refused to leave anyone behind. Similar letters arrived from other families, widows and children and siblings of the men Robert had saved, sharing stories of lives lived fully because of his actions 2 decades earlier. The letters didn't erase Robert's trauma or magically solve his struggles, but they provided context that helped him understand the lasting impact of his service. In his speech to the assembled audience, Robert didn't minimize the challenges he'd faced or pretend that recognition alone could solve the complex problems faced by homeless veterans. Instead, he talked about the importance of seeing veterans as complete human beings, capable of both extraordinary courage and ordinary struggles, deserving of celebration for their service and support for their ongoing needs. "Heroes aren't superhuman," Robert said. "We're just people who did what needed to be done in specific moments. But we're still people, with all the complications that come with being people. The goal isn't to put veterans on pedestals, it's to make sure we have the support we need to keep living meaningful lives after our service ends." Sarah Martinez, now working as a full-time journalist covering veterans issues, watched from the audience as Robert spoke. Her article had launched her career, but more importantly, it had contributed to real changes in how America supported its most decorated veterans. The Medal of Honor that Robert wore that evening, the same medal he'd received 20 years earlier, no longer felt like a burden. It wasn't because his trauma had disappeared or because his struggles were over. It was because he'd learned that carrying the medal didn't mean carrying it alone. After his speech, Robert was approached by a young Army veteran who was struggling with his own transition to civilian life. As Robert listened to the soldier's story and offered whatever wisdom his experience could provide, he realized that his mission hadn't ended when he left the military. It had just evolved. Some heroes get remembered in monuments and history books. Others get remembered in the lives they save and the people they inspire to keep going when giving up seems easier. Robert Chen was both kinds of hero, but he preferred the second kind, because that's the kind that keeps making a difference, long after the ceremonies end and the applause fades away. This story was brought to you by Daily Soldier Stories. Have you ever walked past someone without seeing who they really were? Share their story in the comments, and if this reminded you that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, subscribe to support the channel. Sometimes the most important stories are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look close enough to see them.